Well, I think you've probably noticed this too in Western countries, and I'm kind of going to group the UK, Canada, and the US in this sphere. We
Mhm.
almost act as if things like divorce and like drug use are just inherent parts of life,
Okay.
that this is just normal. This is what happens to everybody everywhere.
Mm.
It's not true.
Yeah.
It's just not true. One of the biggest shocks for me going to live in Canada when I was 12 was seeing how common it was for people to be divorced, for people
Hmm.
to have kids out of wedlock. That's something that it was a culture shock to me.
I'm going to jump in and I'm going to tell you something hilarious.
Go for it.
I didn't know that you could have a child without being married to someone until I was about 10 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I legitimately didn't. And I think I found out from Jerry Springer or The Maury Show. I
No, but
didn't know.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, go ahead. I just thought that would be a
Well,
fun thing.
I think I kind of had a similar perspective, right? I went to these schools, Asian cultures, everyone's families were together. I had never, like, in Quebec, you have all these kids because no one gets married with double-barreled names. So you have
Mhm.
the mother's last name and the father's last name. I didn't know what that was. I met my first friend who had divorced parents. It was a culture shock. And same thing with like drug addiction, like
Mhm.
in schools in like Hong Kong and stuff. I'm not saying that there are no drugs, but there's not this overwhelming culture of drug use. And I see in the US and Canada there are these huge debates over legalization versus criminalization versus yada yada yada. And I'm kind
Mhm.
of standing over here like, okay, but can we talk about why so many of you are doing this in the first place?
Yeah.
Because this is a cultural issue that is not present in other countries. In
Mm.
Western societies, we have like a chemical dependence on things like drinking and drug use, and I want to know why that is, not just argue about, well, are we allowed to do it? Even if you're allowed to do it, this should worry you.
How do people respond when you say that?
I often get told that I'm a prude, I'm overreacting, things like that. And it's
Yeah.
what? Like there's an opioid epidemic, and I think not to say that smoking weed is the same thing as doing taking opioids, but I think that whole mentality of self-medicating
Mm.
and indulging in, I guess, mind altering like substances, that is cultural, and you can't say that the two are completely divorced from each other because other places don't have these issues. So that was a huge thing.
Okay.
Something else that I also noticed was that the US is really safe in a lot of areas, and so is Canada. I don't want to say otherwise,
Mm.
but in American cities specifically, and unfortunately in places in Europe too, it does feel very dangerous. Like I grew up Southeast Asia. I went to a lot of developing countries. I never felt less safe than I
Yeah.
did when I was like walking through Compton when I was
Mm.
a university in
Mhm.
Los Angeles. And that shouldn't happen in a developed country. There's a crime problem in these cities that no one seems to want to talk about.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, people are always surprised by that. When I tell people I grew up in Saudi Arabia,
Hmm.
one of the first things people often say is, "Oh, was it safe there, or isn't it really dangerous there?" And I'm like, it's literally safer than the UK and US. Like if I'm going around a Saudi city, I feel safer than, like you said, than
Hmm.
Los Angeles or London or New
Yeah.
York or anything like that. And then, some people will say, "Oh, that's just because you're a man or whatever." And I'm like, I
No.
don't think it is. It is legitimately safer. This is not saying that there are no other problems, but a lot of the social issues, this is really what you've been saying, a lot of the social
Right.
issues that exist in the West, they're just not really a thing there,
Hmm.
right? They do have their other issues. Like I don't know, like people have very like binary ways of thinking these days, and they think it's either like all this way or all
Or
that
all,
way.
yeah.
And it does seem like humans struggle, especially collectively, to sort of find a nice balance. I mean, in some regards, I certainly think Saudi Arabia, it's changing quickly now, but I certainly think it is too conservative in some aspects. But at the same time, in the modern world in 2020, I think the UK and USA and Canada are too liberal in some aspects, to the point that it's
Right.
like all standards are kind of, there aren't even supposed, this, even the suggestion of there being standards sort of offends people. And it's like, no, they're like our standards, there are some there are some activities and things we probably should shame, that there should be a stigma around, even if it's legal, right? It shouldn't be,
Shouldn't be
it shouldn't,
good. You
no, it shouldn't
shouldn't
be
say
considered
this is,
good. We shouldn't
yeah.
aspire to it. You shouldn't, and people just get very offended with it and stuff. And yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's interesting. And I think that's something that people like us who have really sort of grown up in different places are just very likely to experience. But
yeah, and it's hard because I think people don't understand why this is important. And as someone who's seen the different outputs of both cultures, you're very clearly able to say, okay, this is why all of the children in these schools are misbehaving, right? This is why there's so much poverty because of single parent households. Like, you're able to draw those distinctions and say, hey, X happens here, but not over here. And so this is why the results are so different. But I think a lot of people, they're not able to kind of make that connection. I know I've done so many videos about when the mother, okay, yeah, single mother homes. I was drawn between fatherless and single mother. Yeah, single mother homes, and how it has ravaged specific communities. And, I talk about it, and I talk about how this leads to kind of a perpetual cycle of poverty, how these kids are less likely to graduate from high school. They're more likely to go to prison, have behavioral problems. And it's really just setting these kids up for, I'm not going to say certain failure, because some kids from single parent homes do amazing, but they don't have the same opportunities that they might otherwise have. And in response to that, I have people say, well, you don't actually care about the Black community because you don't support this welfare program. Like, I'm trying to help all communities.
Do you know
all of them?
Do you know, have you always been somewhat conservative, would you say?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. So you're like me. We haven't really sort of like changed,
No.
Part of the reason for that with me is, besides just how I was raised and, my family values and stuff, but part of it, something I see a lot, one of my sort of big problems with leftism/liberalism is lots of the ideas, a lot of the social ideas they are the root of a lot of problems. So they create these problems and then want to use the government to fix these problems that they've created with these ideas. Do you see what I mean? So if you talk about something like fatherless homes, single motherhood, or whatever, anyone who's remotely honest knows that this is a problem, right? You can look at the statistics. You can see the percentage of men in prison who grew up in homes without fathers. You can see the effect on crime rates, the effect on school grades and success, income, all those kind of things. These are just facts. This isn't to shame anyone or whatever, right? These are facts. But a lot of what has encouraged that and has encouraged, all the, the no-fault divorces and, broken families and totally destigmatizing everything. It's like all of this is creating, and then not to mention the welfare policies, it's like you're creating the problem. And now you want to shout at me, you want to shout at you, because we're not, so we'd rather talk about the root rather than just take the government and throw more money or resources or whatever at, trying to patch a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And it's like, no, like, why is the bullet wound there? Can we talk about this? And then people get offended and everyone wants to be politically correct. And you say you're shaming single mothers, or you're doing this. And I don't know. I find it very frustrating. That's just one example, but it seems to happen on a lot of issues.
No, it really does. And what is frustrating is the whole shaming aspect, because I think a lot of these single mothers, we're at a point now, like, everyone loves to blame millennials for all the problems. And I don't give them any free passes, but a lot of the single mothers now likely grew up with single mothers themselves, right? The baby boomers are the ones who started the whole divorce trend or single parenthood trend. It's gone up, but if you come from that background, you are way, way more likely to have a child out of wedlock yourself. So we have an entire generation of people right now who don't know what a traditional family structure even looks like, right? Because they were failed by not only, in some ways their upbringing, but also by the education system, who thinks it's more important to tell people about how oppressed they are versus, okay, these are the facts we know about how you can be productive in life and how you can ensure that you have a better future for yourself. So it's not about shaming anyone. It's about trying to trying to help people by sharing this information, saying, hey, you may have been told something else, that it's going to be fine, there's no difference, but actually the statistics, like you say, paint a very different picture.
Yeah.
And it's to help them, it's not to shame them.
I do not scam. Put some respect on my name.